9 October 1955. Grenzdurchgangslager Friedland, Lower Saxony. In a small notebook, a man named Karl wrote a sentence that could not have been spoken aloud in the village that would soon receive him. Here we ration the truth more strictly than butter. He had been given a pencil at the registration table after the inoculation line and the lice inspection. He had been handed a cup of weak coffee and a card with his name typed crooked, Brenner, Karl, B. 1912, Hildesheim district, repatriated from Karaganda. He counted the loops of barbed wire and the shoulder patches of young German policemen who had been boys when he marched east, and he counted the freight cars rolling in with more men who smelled like coal dust and disinfectant. He counted without moving his lips. The mathematics of return. Friedland was a gate. It was built in September 1945 to catch what fell back through post-war cracks: displaced persons, forced laborers, POWs drifting home from France, from Norway, from the USSR, women from brothels attached to depots, orphans with no languages left in common with the people who would now claim them. The British zone authorities kept files at Friedland with neat columns and decision lines. They tallied names and addresses that had been rubble for years. They noted weights, the deficit on faces. They made, whenever possible, a route from this gate to a town, a farm, a bed. Karl had been gone 12 years. He had walked away from his village in 1943, a private in a signals unit whose training had been a pencil and a ledger. He was capture number P5261N in the records of a Soviet filtration camp near Kharkov. He had been shipped east with a boxcar of men who coughed toward a line of factories whose names he would not learn. Then further, past Volga names he could not place on any map left in his head. He broke ore, and he logged wood in a camp where the wind made its own vocabulary, and every word meant cold. The guard who pronounced his surname did it like a bark. He learned not to speak. He learned to count calories with his eyes, and to refuse the arithmetic of justice that would have justified bitterness. He learned to survive as a number. Friedland's loudspeakers called numbers too, but here the numbers were tied to buses and not to work details. Men laughed differently when their numbers were called to a bus. They wept cheering. A British officer in a wool coat watched the lines and noted in his report for that day that morale is high despite a certain confusion. Allied intelligence summaries from those years are calm on paper. They enumerate food shortages and make neat judgments about German character, as if temperament were a rationable thing. Population appears docile. Primary concerns are caloric intake and securing shelter for winter. One 1946 report from the Hildesheim Military Government Detachment reads, "The arithmetic of relief measured in barrels, in sacks, in tons." Karl waited for his bus. He wrote his one line into the notebook. The bus would take him toward Hildesheim. He would get off a stop early, walk along a road filled with carts. He would recognize nothing. 2 May 1945. Hildesheim's rubble was still warm in places. The March raid had cracked the late medieval city down to cellars. Occupation reports filed in the first week after capitulation speak in numbers. 75% housing destroyed, 2/3 of churches roofless, water pressure unstable in most districts, dead still in shelters under blocked staircases. A British captain photographed a line of women passing bricks hand to hand. Later, they would be called Trümmerfrauen. Then, they were simply women who could not wait to grieve because winter returns, regardless of who has died. They made piles out of what had fallen apart. They stacked brick face to face, as if the future were a simple question of stacking. In Karl's village south of the city, Lamspringe, old monastery, small square, fields that had been ploughed by hands that had saluted too much. The war's end came as a knock. The mayor, who had been appointed in 1933 by a party committee that had been called something other than a committee, was suddenly nobody. A man arrived with a British sergeant and a typed paper that said he was mayor now. The village schoolteacher, who had taught about race with a chart and measured skulls with a caliper that he bought from a catalogue, was told to stop teaching. Mothers bunched in corners of the square when the first jeep came around the bend. Children found dried-up ersatz coffee in the attic and ate it raw. Fear existed, but it existed like weather, a constant. The arithmetic of survival never quite changed its variables. The helping of fear added to the portion of hunger, still always equaled silence. That week, a woman named Lotta wrote to a sister who had fled west from East Prussia and was somewhere near Hanover, somewhere indefinite, somewhere with fresh rumors and no bread. "Our house stands," she wrote, "but it is no longer ours. The British have given the front room to two men who wear grey coats with yellow triangles. They talk Polish. We do not know from where exactly. We have 3 plates left and I hide them under straw. It is forbidden to be on the street after 9. Emma's husband is missing." This letter survives in a shoebox that a son folded together with ration cards and a photograph of a man in a uniform that no son wanted to admire. Oral histories conducted in the 1980s with Lotte and with 3 others who remembered that spring ring with the same practical cadence. What bread? What coal? Where is he? The "where is he?" was the question breathed like prayer. Lists posted at town halls half answered it. Allied intelligence compiled names of German POWs held in camps in the West. The Soviet Union did not. The Red Army had the right of conquest and a famine to feed. Germans had invaded and killed and made mass graves the vocabulary of the century. The Soviet state did not prioritize Western hopes for the return of men like Karl. The mathematics of atrocity had already been written in too many columns: burned villages, shot hostages, the ring of blocked sewers around Leningrad turned into graves. That arithmetic did not balance in fragile huts on the steppe. It did not balance in Karl's world either, but he learned to stop expecting a ledger. Summer 1945. The British regulated life by directives: milk, coal, bicycle registration, curfews. There were posters that demanded surrender of small arms and posters that warned against fraternization wars too late. 2 weeks after capitulation, a directive required the showing of a film. KZ was shown in Hildesheim at the cinema, whose roof had not collapsed. Soldiers and civilians were told to watch. Bergen-Belsen was 30 kilometers away. The film was made by British cameramen shaking with what they saw. People who went to the cinema alibied their eyes with different words afterward. Some stamped away and said it was propaganda. Some swallowed hard and said nothing. The British recorded attendance numbers, audience comportment. They were not measuring souls. They were measuring compliance. The arithmetic of re-education looked like this: so many showings, so many seats filled, so many heads facing forward. The rest remained uncounted. Autumn 1945. Displaced persons camps clipped the edges of ordinary towns. Near Celle, in the shadow of Bergen-Belsen's barbed wire, a camp blossomed with languages: Yiddish, Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian. The survivors of a labor system designed to kill survived that design and found themselves next to German villages whose survivors complained more audibly about fleas than about history. An Allied report about DP conduct in September 1945 describes incidents of unauthorized requisitioning and notes that local German complaints are frequent and often vehement. The words unauthorized requisitioning mean crossing a threshold and taking a chicken that had been counted for the British for feeding Germans. The words, often vehement, mean that the first arguments across the wire turned backward into the village street. At the edge of Lambspringe, a sawmill hired poles under British oversight. A village carpenter wrote that they drank too loudly. He left unsaid that the sawmill owner had used forced labor in 1942 and had paid them in soup. Everyone in the sources of those months chooses words carefully. The mathematics of contact with victims always included distance. Distance in kilometers. Distance in the grammar of things left out. Distance measured in the frequency with which someone said, "It was done in our name," compared to the frequency with which someone said, "We too suffered." Winter, 1946-47. The hunger winter. This is in every source. The arithmetic bites. Calories per person averaged below 1,300 in parts of the British zone. Coal froze in wagons along iced rails. Pipes burst. Children were photographed in coats too large, cheeks pinched, feet in newspaper inside shoes. People. The British called it an administrative crisis. Germans called it cold and hunger, and the cost of war always paid by the bodies in line. The black market descended from the ceiling like a stage set that no one had ordered but everyone used. Cigarettes became currency because cigarettes held their value better than Reichsmarks and better than words. One pack of Lucky Strikes could be 2 kilos of potatoes or 1 pair of stockings. Packages fell from lorries, and the mathematics of hunger ran through hands as fast as fingers could count. Ration cards were numbered survival. A woman at a bureau stamped them with the emotionless rhythm of someone paid to maintain scarcity. She had been born in 1908, the denazification file for her position says, and had joined nothing, signed nothing, taught no slogans. She was, the Spruchkammer wrote in its clerkly script in 1947, Category the 4th, Mitläufer, follower, eligible for immediate re-employment. The mathematics of guilt had 5 categories. I, major offenders. 2, offenders. 2, lesser offenders. 2, lesser offenders. IV, followers. V, exonerated. Hundreds of thousands filled out the Fragebogen, the questionnaire with up to 131 questions probing into membership lists and dates and signatures. Allied interrogators flipped through answers looking for lies disguised as blanks. They found both. They found men who had ordered eviction of Jews, saying they had ordered only the delivery of notices. They found women who had joined the party because their boyfriends had taken them to dances in party halls. They found teachers who had declared a Volkisch approach to grammar. They found a nation auditioning for the role of misled. The questionnaires were stacked on shelves in offices that had been thrown together in prefabricated barracks. Clark, like Karl, if he had been home, would have been hired to file. The Spruchkammer in Hildesheim had a tired secretary who wrote ehemaliger Soldat, kein Boys für Verbrechen, aus Entnazifizierung entlassen, so often that the letters blurred. The system needed stability. The Allies recorded this necessity as an observation and then as policy. To run a police station, the British needed policemen. To run a school, the Americans needed teachers. To collect garbage, to inspect drains, to keep books, they needed hands that had made a Nazi state practical. Some major offenders went to prison. A few were imprisoned and released, and imprisoned again as jurisdiction shifted. Plenty returned to office desks. A head of a cultural department in one city was placed on leave in 1946 for being an early party member, and returned in 1949 under a different title. A note in his denazification file says, unersetzbar, in pencil in the margin. Irreplaceable. Another note says, nicht belastet, which means not incriminated but sounded to his neighbors like absolution. The mathematics of guilt is not elegant. It is an accounting of who gets to pick up their pen again. Meanwhile, the rooms filled. The expulsions from the East had started before the war ended fully. For Karl, this became not statistics, but neighbors. Between 1945 and 1949, millions of expellees came from Silesia, East Prussia, the Sudetenland, Pomerania. They walked. They rode behind tractors. Some had Red Army soldiers riding the tractors. They were put in trains. Some were dead when the trains stopped in the West. Allied documents describe wild expulsions and organized transfers, as if legality had the power to soften a hard event. The result was that streets whose houses had been roofless now had floors turned into rooms with chalk lines. A family of 5 from Breslau took the attic in a house in Lamspringe, moved in with the permission of the British district officer and the curses of a woman downstairs who had kept her house through 2 raids and did not want to share her stove. The woman downstairs had a son missing on the Eastern Front. The family upstairs had left a grave with a wooden cross whose letters washed away in a snow they had not been meant to see. Housing offices were set up with new stamps that made old property disputes into official disputes. The arithmetic of rooms was brutal and civic. You had a room with a bed. You had to share a room with your son's wife. You had a pantry. The pantry became a place to sleep. You had a barn. The barn became a makeshift address for a man whose address in Königsberg was now a letter in a lost alphabet. A file from the Wohnraumbewirtschaftungsamt in Hildesheim shows names crossed out and reinscribed with red ink. Karl's name was on none of those files yet, but his wife's was. She had signed forms she never thought she would sign. She had guarded a spoon in a pocket like a jewel because it was hers and because she needed to measure sugar precisely. The arithmetic turned marital too. In 1947, a priest wrote to the British about the moral state of his parish. "We have many new unions which the Church cannot bless," he wrote. The categories of missing, presumed dead, and waiting changed hearts and rooms. Laws allowed war widows to marry again after 7 years. People shortened 7 to 3 in their own minds. Some returned and found a wife sharing a bed. Some returned and found their wives looking for another. Most did not return. Karl wrote no letters. His wife, Anna, wore a ring in 1945 and took it off in 1948 and put it back on when a notice came from a government office saying the status of the repatriation of her husband was un-Jewish, uncertain. She wore a string on her finger so that she would not forget that being a wife meant faith without evidence. She read the newspaper with its announcements of new parties and its notices of currency reform. She read the obituaries. She ran their household with a merciless economy that does not come from ideology, but from empty plates. June 20, 1948. Currency reform. In the British and American zones, people lined up for Deutsche Marks. The Reichsmark died with a gesture. Germans got 40 DM immediately, then more later. The effect on the street was instantaneous. Shop windows dark for years or full of paper cows instead of meat and paper radios instead of radios filled overnight. People called it the Wirtschaftswunder in embryo, stunned by the speed with which shelves could fill and the black market could flee. Cigarettes lost their throne. The mathematics of butter changed. So did the mathematics of resentment. Expellees watched locals with saved goods buy more. Locals watched expellees step into lines with the same entitlement as if they had always been from here. Petitions to occupation authorities rose, crisp and self-righteous, about unjust distributions. The very next day, the Soviet authorities cut off access to Berlin. The airlift began. Karl, in Karaganda, did not watch Dakota aircraft fly into Tempelhof every 3 minutes, but the village children did. They counted planes and argued about whether the German future would be an American plane and an American chocolate bar, or a Russian parade and a Russian bread. They counted airplanes like other people count omens. The arithmetic of the Cold War entered the chalkboard in the school that seemed to always lack chalk. 1949. The Basic Law. The Federal Republic declared itself in Bonn. The posters went up again, but they were about parties that promised a way through. Not glory, not empire, just meat, bread, a salary, privacy, and a place to forget. Konrad Adenauer built a state on abstinence from extremes and on an alliance with men who had once served extremes. The British closed some of their files and handed them to German ministries. The Americans loaded sacks stamped GROA, and then words would appear like Marshall Plan in the mouths of men who would later run companies. The mathematics of aid is simple: tonnage, credits, ship names, warehouses, distribution points. The mathematics of legitimacy is not. It is a ledger of silences and of names not required to be spoken. Karl's return can be plotted against all these curves: hunger rations, and then real coffee, denazification, and then new tenants, Allied occupation, and then German police. The question of guilt as a social code. The village he would walk back into had moved on, because villages always do. They had found a seat for expellees on the council. They had reinstated a policeman who had been suspended for 6 months for beating a communist in 1932. He now wore the green uniform of a democratic state. His denazification file says that his impeccable service during the post-war period has erased doubts. The mathematics of redemption in the 1950s could be written as a year of decent work equals the forgetting of a sentence. It could also be written as a community will forgive itself faster than it will forgive the return of someone who saw the East from the other side. He carried his release paper like a shield. It was stamped by men who had nothing to do with the villagers who would read it. The paper said he had been in Karaganda and that he had no disease other than those that would not travel. He was told that in Friedland he would receive a small package, a personal ration of chocolate, and that he could post a letter free of charge. He wrote to Anna. "I am coming," he wrote. He wrote that he was thinner, that he would try not to bring the cold in his suitcase. He did not write what he had seen. He had seen men eat toothpaste for the sugar in it. He had seen a man beat another man with a frozen fish. He had seen snow pile on roofs studiedly, as if it were the purpose of the camp to hold weight. He had seen birthdays pass like leak-proof buckets. He had learned that to survive you must stop keeping certain kinds of company with yourself. He did not write any of that. 13 October 1955. Lamspringe. He arrived at the village at dusk. The church tower had been patched, blocks of new stone shouting their newness against the old. The monastery had a new function, a school for boys who could pay. The square had a bus stop. A poster announced a dance for the Expellees Association in the district hall. There was a bench where he had kissed Anna once when they were 20, and when the future had been something you could calculate with wages, times years. He stood in the square, and only after a moment did he remember to move. She lived 2 streets away from where he remembered living. The house had been traded when a British officer had ordered the upstairs converted to a room for expellees. A new tenant had offered a stove in exchange for the front garden. The old house had 3 families in it now. He would learn all this gradually. He would learn the names. He would learn the names. He would learn the etiquette of returning late. He knocked. She answered. She looked at him as if he had walked into their kitchen from the pantry. She did not cry immediately. He did not. Her hand hesitated, an internal inventory of what the body was allowed to do in a room that had been renamed normal. She said, "Karl." He said, "Anna." It could have been 7 years earlier. It could have been never. There was a man there that he did not know. His name was Victor. He worked in the sugar factory rebuilt with martial aid. The sack said USA in blue. Victor had a wife and a small child upstairs. The child had a cough. Victor stood. He was an expellee from the East. He had been allotted a room where Karl's wardrobe had once stood. He kept his shirts in a suitcase, because luggage is the only furniture that thieves do not steal in transit. He watched Karl like someone measuring a doorframe. The arithmetic in that room had too many variables. Anna said, "You will sleep on the couch." He said, "Yes." He kept his suitcase shut in the corner. He watched the child and thought of those who had died because the snow ate their names. He watched the new man in his old room and saw only that he was a man who had also been displaced and had not asked for this arrangement with the past. He watched Anna draw coffee, now real, from a tin someone had given her. She served it like guilt. All the cups had chips. She did not say anything about the Gulag. He did not volunteer sorrow for the 10,000 words that no one in this village wanted to hear in one piece. The next days he walked the fields that had been his before they belonged to the agricultural cooperative. There was a new tractor. The horse he remembered was dead. He stood by the hedge where once he had kissed Anna again, and now the hedge was shorter. He could not locate why it mattered that hedges could be shorter. The habit of measuring had become life itself. He went to the town hall. He stood in line. The woman at the counter stamped papers for accommodation, papers for food, papers for identity. He watched her stamp and wondered if she had ever stamped death warrants with such vigor, and then he reproached himself because that is not what clerks in small German towns did, even when their rulers ordered mass arrests. He had become uncharitable in some corners of his thinking. He recognized this as a scar. He asked about work. His old job in the sawmill had been filled by an expellee named Roman, who had learned the job quickly and had 3 children. Karl's wartime military rank had not been high enough to entitle him to any pension. His camp work did not count toward anything except the condition of his teeth. The town secretary, who had seen men like him come and not last, turned to a file. She pulled a paper. "Wohnraumwirtschaftungsamt needs a clerk," she said. He thought that the mathematics of return had a punchline after all. He took the job. He learned to allocate space with the same sobriety with which the camp had allocated pain. He learned the ratio of beds to rooms, of persons per cubic meter, of quarrels per stairwell. He learned to listen to arguments about stoves that were really arguments about belonging. He learned to find pettiness interesting because it meant that people had the luxury to argue about minutiae in a time that measured itself once in deaths per road. He learned to carry the files to the storage room and to tie them with twine and to stamp them, erledigt. He learned also that the arithmetic of guilt was not finished. Men who had been far deeper in the party than they had told the Spruchkammer wore ties. They wore civic positions as if they had never worn anything else. One afternoon, a representative of the Volksbund drove through collecting donations for the graves of the fallen. Karl watched him speak and saw in his wrists a familiar bluntness. He had perhaps hammered slogans into meetings once. Now he collected coins for gravestones. In his notebook, Karl wrote, "We build monuments to our dead, and we forget to build sentences for our living." He went through denazification files as part of his work, not to judge but to assign rooms to men who now signed forms as citizens. File 331-45, Müller, Albin, joined Party 1937, block leader, denazified as Category 4, employed as schoolmaster again, 1950, notes that he brought children to anti-Bolshevik exhibition, 1943, file 502-46, Vogel, Irmgard, head of women's section of local party, denazified as Category 3, employed as typist, 1948, file 1118-48, Weber, Hans, Sesse in 1932, police auxiliary, 1933, denazified as category. The mathematics of guilt repeated itself across those pages, not 0 and not 1, but fractions whose numerators differed by events remembered only behind tongues. He saw also files for the expelled who were enumerated by the word vertrieben. The abbreviations multiplied. BKD, Bundesvertrieben Eingesetz, the federal law to cover their rights. KLV, Kollektivliste Vertriebener, the list of those to be accommodated. He saw their cards with their lists of professions. Miller, typist, farmer. He saw their signatures, scribbles from hands that wanted to be steady. The arithmetic of compassion is not measurable, but he tried to balance this ledger. He gave rooms to those whose working days he judged too long. He gave rooms to those whose eyes did not beg. He gave rooms to those who said too many times that they deserved more, and he gave rooms to those who had not spoken. The village whispered about fairness, as if fairness had been a virtue before 1933. The school changed. New textbooks pulled out the claws of old. The old National Socialist arithmetic problems about bombs and enemies vanished. They were replaced by problems that priced out bricks and bread, and by sentences about the dignity of man. But the chapter on 1933 to 1945 was brief. It was as if the new democracy did not trust its children to walk through history with their eyes open. The school taught them that there had been a madman, and that many had been misled, and that many had also been brave in small ways, and that Germans had suffered in Dresden and in the camps for Sudeten Germans in 1945 and on the roads west. The school did not teach the teachers' names. The arithmetic of education was simple, survival first, nuance later. Simple was safer when the classrooms had new glass in their windows for the first time in 10 years. In 1952, a British officer returned to Lamspringe on a nostalgia tour. He asked after the Trimmerfrauen. He asked after ration cards, chuckling. He confessed to the new mayor that he had stolen 2 chickens during his first winter in the district. Such were the predations of a hungry stomach. The mayor gave him coffee. He laughed. A British newspaper published his reminiscences. In them he wrote that the Germans were practical to a fault, and that he had known then that they would rebuild and move on quickly. He did not write about the mathematics of forgetting that covered his own theft. He did not have to count it. He wasn't counted here at home. Karl married Anna again. That is how he wrote about it in his notebook. We married again, he wrote, without a priest, without a new certificate, but with the same bed. He did not admonish her for the ring she had removed. He did not ask her about the nights he had not owned. He did not want to do the arithmetic of fidelity in a time that had divided lives by months. They had no children. The camps had stolen his strength where it cannot be healed by food. They bought a radio. They listened to elections. They listened to the first testimonies about Auschwitz broadcast in hesitant German to ears that wanted not to be ears. In 1955, the Chancellor went to Moscow. The news came to the village like a bell. More men would return. He would return with them. It was a gesture of state and a move in a Cold War that measured gestures like chess moves. The arithmetic of the Cold War balanced every compassion against a threat. The East Germans watched. The West Germans watched. The Russians watched. Karl counted only the days until a paper with his name on it would move from one box into another. The mathematics that mattered to him was the length of a line at Friedland. He did not care who scored the political point for his life. He returned, as you have seen, with one sentence in his notebook. He returned and found that the village had a new habit. It spoke often of war victims, and rarely of victims of Germans. It had placed on the church wall a plaque that read, Den Opfern von Krieg und Gewaltschaft, to the victims of war and tyranny. This phrase was chosen deliberately in many places. It was chosen to name all without specifying too many. It was a subtlety that felt like a comfort when the dead were dear. It was an evasion when guilt needed grammar. No memorial said, "In our name." The arithmetic of commemoration asked for unity and got it by blunting edges. He did not become a dissident. He did not become a man with a sign in the square. He became the clerk who paid attention to verbs. "We were forced," men said about the party. "We were misled," others added. He came to prefer "I did" when it was said, even if it was said about small things. He counted the times a man in town said, "I did," to be kind, and the times someone said, "I did," to be cruel. Ordinary mathematics. I recorded neither. He was not an archivist of conscience. He was a man trying to keep the heat on, to keep the stairwell fights about stoves from becoming police matters. His work was the arithmetic of peace. An American relief convoy came one winter with corn flour and dried eggs. They gave the village a crate. The label said ECA, Economic Cooperation Administration. The same hands that had thrown grenades at American jeeps now opened sacks with sewing scissors. The men who had once hung portraits in public buildings now hung ledgers on nails. The women who had once cleaned barracks now polished the foyer of the new city hall. The arithmetic of adaptation is perhaps the only arithmetic that we ever learn to do fluently. The files in the Bundesarchiv will one day count the tonnage of what arrived. They will count the minutes of council meetings and the number of names on compensation rolls. They will count the letters written by men who wanted to be recognized as victims when they had once been participants. They will not count the number of times Karl carried a box of files down a flight of stairs and cursed his knees. In 1957, the school replaced textbooks again. The new books had a chapter on guilt that put more nouns on more pages. They had pictures of starved faces. The teacher did not show the chapter to the fourth form. He kept it for the eighth. He said, "Too soon," when a mother asked. The arithmetic of pedagogy, he would have said, has a right and a wrong time to carry difficult sums. Sometimes the right time never comes. Denazification had closed in paperwork, if not in hearts. Many files were finalized with belastet or nicht belastet and bound with twine. Their margins grew yellow. Some were lost. Some were thrown out in the 1960s when offices needed rooms that had once been archives. Some survived because a clerk like Karl could not bring himself to toss away a kind of ledger that had once structured a life so completely. His conscience, built on arithmetic, insisted that columns be kept even if they were no longer added up. He was not a moralist. He did not stand on chairs to tell the village what it had done. He did not cross to the DP camp by the rail yard to perform penances. He saw a woman who had survived the camps walking in town 20 times before he realized who she might be. And when he did not speak. She wore a headscarf that no local woman wore. She walked with her shoulders pulled forward. Her name was Rosa. She had married a man from Lodz who had secured a job at the metalworks. She would not learn High German. She would count her words. In the archive, we have a police report complaining that foreign elements at the metalworks laughed during a speech on Republic Day. The police report is precise. It names her husband as one of those who had laughed. It does not say why. The policeman wrote, "disrespectful." He did not write, "perhaps the speech did not speak to them." The arithmetic of inclusion was slow. Karl saw the report. He wrote a note, "No action." He had the authority to write that. It is a small act. It sits in a file like a pebble. There were other pebbles. A man who had been SA in 1932 came drunk to the housing office one day and shouted at Karl. He insisted that his service in the time of Anschluss had given him the right to a larger apart.